What do you like? Tell me what you like.
I love the idea of nourishing both our body and our soul.
Welcome to the Nourishing You podcast presented by the National Association of Nutrition Professionals, NANP. We invite you to join Kristen Burkett and Diana Walley as they host experts from the holistic wellness space who will share practical tips and information to enhance your health and vitality. Kristen and Diana are master nutrition therapists and board certified in holistic nutrition, with private practices that support their clients as they strive to reach their full potential. If you enjoy today's show, please help us out by commenting below, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel to help us spread the word.
You have to move your body. That's my message. That's my passion.
This episode of the Nourishing You podcast is brought to you by Nutrition Therapy Institute, NTI.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Nourishing You podcast. Today, Diana and I are going to tackle a topic that almost everyone has heard about by now, the food pyramid and the new dietary guidelines. Whether you remember the original food pyramid from school, the government's My Plate graphic, or you've seen headlines about the newly released guidelines, nutrition recommendations have evolved quite a bit over the years.
Nutrition professionals, we thought it would be interesting to talk through the new dietary guidelines, specifically covering three main topics. So we're going to talk about what's changed, what's stayed the same, and what we think these updates mean for everyday people trying to make healthy food choices. And to be clear, this isn't about politics or controversy. It's really about understanding the recommendations and helping our listeners apply them in a way that works for their unique needs. Kristen, I think we're pretty good at simplifying complex nutrition topics and making them practical and easy to implement for people. So let's dig in.
Yeah, let's see what we can do. Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's first just say, what exactly are the dietary guidelines and who creates them?
So the dietary guidelines for Americans are jointly created and published every 5 years. So a lot of people don't realize that it's every 5 years. And they're developed jointly by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is known as HHS. This is done through a multi-step process that includes an advisory committee that reviews the current scientific literature. The guidelines form the foundation for all federal nutrition policies and programs. So they influence school lunch programs, military nutrition, the SNAP or WIC programs, and are the basis for public health messaging.
So one question people often ask is, it can seem like nutrition science changes faster than the official recommendations. But the reality is that public health guidelines are held to really high standards because they're intended to apply to millions of people. So before a recommendation can become part of national guidance, there has to be a substantial body of evidence to support both the safety and the effectiveness of the recommendations, and ideally a broad scientific consensus. So this means that public health recommendations often move much more slowly than what practitioners might be discussing in clinical practice settings. And then it's also important to recognize the difference between emerging science and established science. So while researchers may identify promising new findings, and we see things like that in the news, but it can often take years of additional studies and validation before those findings are considered strong enough to influence population-wide or public dietary recommendations. So there can be quite a bit of lag time. So as a result, the dietary guidelines tend to reflect where the science is firmly established rather than where it's just beginning to point. So it's not that the prior guidelines were wrong necessarily, but as science evolves, we have to accept and incorporate changes to reflect that current evidence.
And it's also important to understand that the dietary guidelines are designed as population level guidance. So in other words, they're intended to provide a nutritional framework for the average healthy person rather than serve as personalized nutrition planning. And of course, personalization is where nutrition professionals really shine. Because the guidelines appeal to the average healthy American, the recommendations aren't meant to account for every health circumstance either. So think of them as a starting point, a foundation upon which additional individualized recommendations can be built. And we'll talk more about personalization later in the episode, but it's important to keep that distinction in mind as we review the recommendations.
Another thing we noticed is that the pyramid itself is only one small part of the overall guidance. There are actually multiple supporting documents that include serving recommendations based on calorie needs, food quality guidance, added sugar limits, special population recommendations, and much more that can't fit into a simple graphic, which is what most people see is just the pyramid itself. So if you go to the website where these are held, it's called realfood.gov. If you go to that website, there are links to all of these other addendums in there with these more specialized recommendations. And interestingly, that's where the details really shine, and it's what most people really miss. So we're going to try to go into those in a little bit more detail here today.
Okay, so let's break it down. The first thing many people notice is that the pyramid looks very different from the one that many of us grew up with. So what stands out to you, Kristen?
Well, it absolutely looks different. It's pretty much flipped upside down. So if you grew up with the original food pyramid like we did, grains were the foundation of the diet. Bread, cereal, rice, pasta occupied the base of it and was the largest section. And then fats were placed at the very top were something to be used very sparingly. And so when you look at this new graphic, the message is quite different. So we see protein, dairy, healthy fats, fruits, veggies, and whole grains all given meaningful emphasis. And that kind of reflects a shift away from simply maximizing a certain food group and more about the general concept of nutrient density and food quality.
Much better. And that's really the theme throughout the new guidelines. So less emphasis on counting servings from a single category, as you were alluding to, and more focus on choosing nutrient-dense, minimally processed foods. So I consider that a big win.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest changes I see is the emphasis on protein. And I want to break that down into some detail. So to give a comparison, the previous RDA or recommended daily allowance for protein was 0.8 grams per kilograms per day. Most Americans don't think in terms of kilograms and grams, so that can be a little bit confusing. But if to give you an idea, that would be for example, for a 150-pound person, it would be about 54 grams of protein a day. The new guideline is 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. So if we break that down for that same 150-pound person, that's anywhere between 82 and 109 grams per day. So that's a major change, as the updated research is clear that it's so important for maintaining muscle mass, healthy aging, satiety, blood sugar regulation, recovery, and overall metabolic health.
Yeah, and as you said, this is a pretty significant shift. For years, we were told we were eating too much protein. And now we're seeing recommendations that are roughly 50 to 100% higher than that old RDA. So as we learn more about healthy aging, sarcopenia, metabolic health, and the importance of maintaining muscle mass through life, this change makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, you think about women entering perimenopause and menopause, older adults trying to maintain independence and strength, anyone focused on body composition or blood sugar stability. This is probably one of the most practical changes listeners can implement right away.
Oh, for sure. And, for listeners who have heard us discuss or maybe rant, I might be responsible for ranting about protein, the two of us too. We've been talking about this for years. It feels much more aligned with what many practitioners have already been recommending. Of course, there may be individual recommendations that differ, but this is a much better average starting point for most people. And, another notable shift in the updated guidelines is the inclusion of full-fat dairy. The recommendations emphasize choosing dairy products without added sugars, and they also recognize dairy as a valuable source of protein, healthy fats, and vitamins and minerals. And just a quick aside, because I do get a lot of question about this, you can determine if a food has added sugars by checking the label, which will list the total sugar, but then break out added sugars on a separate line. And some people are confused about that, so you can always see that on the label. Okay, so back to healthy fats. Many people don't realize that when fat is removed from foods, the food often becomes less satisfying. And historically, food manufacturers added sugars, starches, other ingredients to improve taste and texture, which sometimes resulted in foods that were lower in fat, but not necessarily more nutritious. And so the new guidelines are a meaningful departure from the messaging many of us grew up with when low fat or fat-free dairy products were heavily promoted, and dietary fat was often viewed as something to be minimized or even the villain. And I know we'll talk more about the importance of healthy fats in a minute, but this just reminded me, thinking back to the fat-free era. I may or may not have eaten boxes of those Snackwell cookies. Do you remember those, Kristen? Those
The
fat-free?
exact same thing. Yes. I thought they were the greatest thing ever.
Totally, totally. Yeah, that just make me giggle.
Yeah.
So anyway, while there's still discussion around the role of different dietary fats, the newer guidelines reflect a broader recognition that whole nutrient-dense foods, including full-fat dairy, can have a place within the balanced diet, and you don't need to eat Snackwell cookies.
Exactly. What about whole grains?
Another thing I appreciate is the distinction between whole grains and processed grains. So in the past, recommendations to eat more grains were often interpreted as eating foods like breads, crackers, cereals, cookies, other flour-based products. And the updated guidelines place a greater emphasis on true whole grains. So things like oats, quinoa, barley, brown rice, buckwheat. And these foods provide more fiber and nutrients and support for blood sugar regulation and gut health. And at the same time, we're encouraged to reduce consumption of refined grain products like the ones I just mentioned. So the white breads, the crackers, boxed breakfast foods, other highly processed flour-based foods. This shift reflects a growing recognition that not all grain foods have the same nutritional impact, and that the quality and degree of processing matter just as much as the food category itself.
Yeah, I think that's the real bingo there about the grains for sure. And another change that many people will notice is that fat, as we were kind of talking about with dairy, is no longer being treated as that villain. So even though my nutrition training has convinced me otherwise, I still have this old messaging in my head that says to avoid fat. I mean, I grew up with it. It's really hard to get it out. I mean, I just had a conversation the other day where my husband said, "But isn't there a lot of fat in that?" And I thought, "Oh my gosh, I haven't taught you anything yet, have I?" Just kidding. It could apply to me or anyone else because I think we're all guilty of it. We grew up with fat makes you fat, but I think that's been very well debunked. But unfortunately, this leads many people toward highly processed, low-fat products that are usually higher in those sugars and additives. So that updated guidance takes a more balanced approach by acknowledging that healthy fats can be an important part of nutritious diet. It specifically mentions fats such as olive oil and even includes options like butter and beef tallow, while also highlighting naturally occurring fats that we get in things like seafood, eggs, nuts, seeds, avocados, and that full fat dairy. So rather than focusing solely on reducing fat intake, the conversation is shifted toward choosing nutrient dense, minimally processed sources of fat and recognizing the important role that fat plays, not only in satiety, but our hormone production, our nutrient absorption, our brain health, and overall wellness. So again, back to that recognition that real whole foods are different in quality and health effects than the refined processed versions of food.
So true. And to that point, Kristen, arguably the strongest messaging throughout the document, and maybe my favorite, is that reducing ultra processed foods and returning to more whole, minimally processed options. And we talk about this all the time on the podcast. So the guidance specifically encourages limiting packaged and those ready to eat foods, sugary beverages, and heavily processed snack foods, while prioritizing nutrient dense foods and home prepared meals whenever you can. What I found particularly interesting is that the recommendations go beyond simply saying, eat less sugar, in quotes. The supporting documents actually provide additional guidance around added sugar limits, and they reference the FDA's healthy criteria and even outline category-specific thresholds for foods like grain products and dairy products, which we've talked about. And this is a great example of why it's important to look beyond the pyramid graphic itself. You alluded to that earlier. While the image offers a helpful overview and it's fun to look at, many of the most practical details, including guidance on added sugars, serving sizes, food quality, and special populations, are found within the accompanying documents rather than just the visual representation alone.
And on another topic, but super exciting, is, as gut health proponents, as we are, one of the additions we are seeing is the direct recognition of gut health and the microbiome within the guidelines themselves. That's never been there before. So for many years, discussions around nutrition focused primarily on calories, macronutrients, and individual nutrients, which are all important, but we're increasingly understanding that the trillions of bacteria living in our digestive tract play a significant role in our overall health. So the updated guidance acknowledges this by specifically discussing the microbiome and encouraging foods that help support a healthy microbial balance. So that would include things like high fiber foods, fermented foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, miso, things like that. It also recognizes that highly processed foods may negatively impact the gut environment and that microbial diversity. I don't think that's ever been talked about before. And so while the section's relatively brief, it's super encouraging to see gut health acknowledged as an important component of nutrition and wellness. And I think it just reflects this growing body of research connecting our microbiome to our digestion, our immune function, metabolic health, and more.
This edition, I was just thinking, it surprised me. Were you surprised that, we've been talking about this for, oh my gosh, 15 years or something? And we've had so many experts on the podcast discussing it, but I was pleasantly surprised to see it included in the guidelines. Were you surprised?
I was surprised. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's being talked about more and more, but from a public health standpoint and to be in the broad-based guidelines, that's a huge recognition of the body of evidence that exists now. So I think that really does reinforce what we have been saying for a long time.
I agree. Feels good.
NTI is a leader in holistic nutrition education. Since 1999, they have provided students with the highest quality training, helping them to achieve thriving careers in the field of holistic nutrition and wellness. What makes NTI different from other nutrition schools? They teach you not only what to do, but why to do it.
Okay, so let's talk about personalization. One phrase that stood out to me in the updated guidelines was the recommendation to eat the right amount for you. And this may sound simple, but it's an important reminder that nutrition is not one size fits all. You and I talk about this all the time on the show. Our needs vary based on factors such as, how old are you, someone's body size, sex, activity level, health status, and very importantly, what are your goals? So, someone who's a highly active athlete, for example, will have very different nutritional needs than a sedentary older adult, even though both can follow the same general nutrition principles. Again, the supporting materials we keep talking about, they go beyond the pyramid graphic and provide serving size recommendations that scale according to a person's caloric needs, with food group targets ranging from approximately 1,000 calories to 3,200 calories per day. This really reinforces the idea that while the overall framework may be the same, the quantities and specific recommendations should be adjusted to fit the individual rather than expecting everyone to follow an identical plan. So I really love this. And it's in line with what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's where the guidelines really become a starting point rather than the finish line. One of the things we appreciate about the guidelines is that they provide this framework, but they also acknowledge that not everyone has the exact same nutritional needs. And, as you said, Diana, this is where that personalization comes in. You've got to consider so many different things. And I think, something for our listeners to think about is if you don't want to go into those addendums and you don't want to understand how to personalize it for yourself based on that extra information, then working with somebody like, you or I or a nutrition therapist can be really beneficial to help you apply those guidelines to your life because they are very in line with what we as holistic nutrition professionals have been, prescribing for a long time. So that's really nice. So yeah, we got to consider stage of life, your health condition, activity, and as you said, it's all gonna change based on your goals and where you are.
That's so true. And I'm glad that you said, I have a few other things to say on that, but I'm really glad that you said stage of life because I I work with clients all the time that will say something like, well, what I'm doing isn't working for me anymore. But that's over a decade. They're still doing the same thing they were doing a decade ago. And their body has changed and their lifestyle has changed. And of course it's not going to work for you. So I think it's not just individual person to person, but throughout your life. I know I've changed my nutrition and exercise, keeping the basics in mind, but changed my nutrition and exercise throughout my life. And I'm assuming the same for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed in getting more into menopause years, it's significantly had to change. And I talk to women all the time that they can't believe the extreme difference in how things change for them with their metabolism, their body composition between like middle 40s to upper 50s, and just what a difference that change in time of life brings to them. I mean, it applies to every stage of life, but I guess it's probably more obvious to me at this point for
I,
that. But yeah,
yeah,
so I think we have to be willing to pay attention to that and recognize that we can't always do what we've always done because our needs change, and it's okay. And it's okay to acknowledge that and respect that and be able to nourish it properly.
100%. Yeah. And so just to kind of build on what you were saying, it kind of, just put a finer point on it. For an example, if you're working with an athlete, versus my mom who's 80, you're going to have a different conversation. So the athlete may have a higher caloric need. It may be substantially higher. Maybe they need more carbohydrate to support their performance and recovery. And then protein becomes very important for muscle repair and adaptation. So that personalization piece is very important.
Yeah, that's so true. And, on the other hand, if you've got someone dealing with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, the general healthy eating principles still apply, but we have to pay much closer attention to the carbohydrate quantity and likely be much lower than that athlete. And the meal composition and even meal timing can make a difference for that blood sugar regulation.
Yeah, and another area that we want to really think about personalization is digestive health. Like the personalization piece there is really critical. So someone with IBS or celiac disease or another digestive condition may not tolerate certain foods that are generally considered healthy for other individuals. So in those cases, therapeutic modifications may be necessary while we work to address the underlying issue. And just another plug for nutrition professionals can be really helpful in this scenario.
Right. So again, the guidelines are a valuable foundation, but all those factors matter and they're meant for the average healthy person as a broad foundation. But I don't think anyone can expect that just if they pluck everything off the pyramid and put it into their diet in random amounts, it's necessarily going to support their needs. their particular stage of life or goals.
That's very well said. And something else we wanted to highlight, there are actually dedicated sections addressing the unique nutritional needs of different populations, including infants and young children, adolescents during periods of rapid growth, women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, older adults who may have changing caloric needs and increased requirements for nutrients like protein, calcium, vitamin D, vitamin B12, also individuals with chronic diseases, and even considerations for vegetarians and vegans.
I was surprised to see all of those different ones outlined, pleasantly surprised. And, I don't think that some of the different diet preferences, such as vegetarian and vegan, has really been addressed in past guidelines. So it's really nice to see that and giving people that want to have that type of a diet some help with how do I do this in a healthier way to support my needs. So I love seeing that there. Another area that caught my attention, interestingly, was alcohol. So it's not a large section in the guidelines, but it's notable that it's included and addressed directly. I mean, you'll notice in the pyramid now, you don't see alcohol. I believe it was actually in the other pyramid. Am I wrong on that? I'm not sure. But
Yeah.
for some reason, I think wine was on there. I don't know. But
That sounds right.
yeah, I think it was. But in any case, with the newer research, the message is very straightforward. When it comes to alcohol, less is generally better for overall health. And the guidelines also recognize that there are certain groups who should avoid it entirely, including groups like pregnant women, individuals taking medications or managing health conditions that might interact negatively with alcohol. So it's definitely a nod to that newer research.
Yeah, and I also appreciated the recommendations that acknowledging some of the individual factors that can influence risk with alcohol, so including a personal or family history of alcohol use disorder. So I agree with you. I think it's very positive, and I'm glad that it's coming into the mainstream conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example of how these guidelines are at least attempting to balance broad recommendations with individual circumstances. So, while some people might choose to include alcohol in moderation, the overall message reflects that growing body of research with as to alcohol's potential effect on certain aspects of health. Just general things like the impact on sleep quality, the liver health, cardiovascular health, cancer risk, metabolic function. It's I think it's just another great reminder that nutrition and wellness aren't just about the foods that we eat, but also the lifestyle choices that influence our long-term health.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so if we had to summarize the biggest shifts in these updated guidelines, I'd say they move the conversation closer to what many nutrition professionals have been discussing for years. So I feel like this is, this is right up our alley. It makes me very excited that, we've been talking about this for years, and to see it now getting out to the general public is very encouraging. So, there's kind of three main things I think we could summarize it by. So, firstly, there's a greater emphasis on adequate protein intake, and Kristen broke down the numbers for us. And of course, that supports muscle mass, healthy aging, satiety, and metabolic health. And I think, even just the past couple of years, protein really has had a glow up, sort of, as the kids say, which is wonderful. Secondly, there's a renewed focus on whole, minimally processed foods, healthier sources of dietary fats, and even recognition of the importance of gut health. We talked about that. And the microbiome and overall wellness. So again, wonderful. And then lastly, there's also stronger messaging around reducing ultra processed foods, added sugars, and we told you how to look at the label and how you're able to tell if there's added sugars in your packaged food. And also, reducing packaged convenience type foods that have become such a large part of the modern diet. And Kristen, I was seeing, I don't know the exact number, but I can confidently say that over 50% of the calories that Americans consume come from ultra processed foods. So this messaging is really important. Have you seen those statistics?
I have, absolutely. Yeah. I was a little stunned by it, but given that that's the case, I'm hoping that more people will consider how that might be influencing their health, and these guidelines may help push them over to better choices for healthier whole foods.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that I really enjoy when I'm working with somebody is let's just say they have, well, the average person eats more than 50% ultra processed foods in their day. I like looking at their food journal or their diet log, and then seeing how we can easily swap those ultra processed foods. It doesn't it, do- not it, do- it to me in an easy way, how they don't have to spend a lot of time in the kitchen or hours cooking or get Bon Appetit magazine or whatever. But how can we simply replace those ultra processed foods? And it's easier than you think. So again, just another plug for working with a professional if that's something that's challenging for you. I don't know what you see with your clients.
Oh, absolutely. I think those swaps are some of the, where we can get the biggest benefit in the shortest amount of time, where people can actually feel the difference in their health. So I love that. Absolutely. I'd say, you know, just as importantly, just recognizing that the guidelines themselves are really acknowledging that nutrition isn't a one size fits all, and that, just reinforce that principle that the pyramid is a framework, but your age, health history, all of those things, life stage, all of those influence what the ideal version looks like for you.
Exactly, exactly. And, again, if people just focus on the basics, I think when I met you long time ago, and I remember back then first meeting you and you talking about, people make nutrition so complicated. We just want to get back to the basics. And now, like, did you write the guidelines? Because now I'm like, oh, maybe you did. I don't know. But this is exactly what you've been saying since I met you. And it's not a sexy message, but it's so important because people, I think they get caught up in feeling as though health and nutrition exercise is very complicated. So then they don't do anything, right? Rather than just focusing on the basics. So things that we've been talking about for years: eating more protein, eating more fruits and veggies, healthier fats, more fiber-rich foods, and again, fewer ultra-processed foods. If people did that, they'd be capturing the spirit of the recommendations. Do you agree with that?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I just want to like hone in on one thing you said there. Like when we're eating more protein or eating more fiber, I just want people to remember that doesn't mean buy the packaged thing that says high in protein,
Mm.
right? Look for the whole real food that naturally has those things, and don't get fooled by the marketing, because that's not going to get you the nutrition that you want with it necessarily. So be careful about that. And like you said, Dana, it's focusing on these basic fundamentals. Just get the whole real food, and it doesn't have to be fancy. I mean, eating an apple is not a fancy endeavor, but it serves a lot of purposes for the body. So
And delicious. They're delicious.
absolutely. So yeah, so I think it's really rewarding to see these guidelines more in alignment with what we've been saying all along and recommending for years.
So before we wrap up, do you mind if I quickly mention the government recommendations on exercise?
No, I think it's a great place to add those.
Okay. Yeah, our regular listeners know that exercise is a friend of the show, so we love talking about it. Because along with proper nutrition, really exercise is essential for health. So, and if you go to the website that I'm pretty sure it's the one that Kristen referenced earlier in the show, you'll see on the bottom right of that homepage, there is a link to look at the exercise recommendations. And they haven't changed, but we really wanted to emphasize it. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. So, the basics are that adults should get 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise a week. So 150 to 300 minutes moderate, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous activity per week. So that's the cardio piece. for your heart, and then also strength training twice a week for your muscle mass. So that again, that hasn't changed, but we really wanted to highlight it because unfortunately, less than 25% of Americans meet these recommendations. So we are going to continue to talk about it. And if you're not exercising, just start walking. Just, grab a pair of comfortable shoes, start to walk 10 minutes a day, and maybe listen to one of our podcasts. We actually have several podcasts on exercise, so you could even queue up one of those, including, how exercise for beginners or focusing more on strength training. But we have some really, really good information on exercise. But just start there, just start somewhere, and then you can build on it. But just do it, as a famous shoe company once said, just do it.
It's really not a choice. Like, I don't know why a lot of people deprioritize it and just don't have time for it, when it's so integral to your health. So hopefully, between choosing more whole, real foods, it might make you even want to exercise a little bit more because you're feeling a little bit healthier, not eating so many ultra processed foods. But pick up those shoes and do something, and just prioritize the fundamentals. And I'll throw sleep in right on top of those exercise guidelines, because if we can eat the whole real foods, get this minimum amount of exercise, and sleep, and really protect your sleep, man, you've got 80% of the health things covered right there, if not more. So it can be pretty rocking.
I think that's so true. And then, the one other thing that came to mind, and something you talk about a lot, is stress reduction. And that might be even the cherry on top, but exercise, to your point, like, exercise will help with that. And so will eating, better food and sleeping. So it is all tied together. And yes, I think that was a really good way to wrap it up. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? Did we cover everything before we sign off?
I think we covered it. There's always going to be controversy about any new policy that comes out. But I think if we strip the politics away and we look at what the spirit of the intention is behind the recommendation, and recognize the research that it's built on, and we take it as a foundation, I think we can gain a lot and not get caught up in the nitpicky things that may not be perfect. Because I could probably find as many things I don't like about it as what I do. But I think focusing on the positive and the ways that it will move our health forward is how we make the most out of it. And, for anything that's so broad-based, that has to be like one picture that applies to everyone in our country, like to come up with something that meets that for the most part, I think that's pretty great. So anyway, I guess that would be my last thing. It's just, instead of nitpicking it, use it for the good that's in there and the intention, and use it to better your life.
That's perfect. I couldn't improve on that. Well, we hope this has been helpful. And Kristen, as always, it's been such a pleasure to talk nutrition with you. We could talk all day, but we won't. We'll end on a high note. We'll keep talking. So, if you know someone who's heard about the new dietary guidelines and is wondering what they actually mean, because there is a lot of confusion, it can be a lot of information, and we really tried to synthesize it down here for you and make it simple. So please share this episode with them, because we think it could be really helpful. And anyone that so please share it, and that helps the show as well. And thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Nourishing You podcast.
This episode was brought to you by NTI. To learn more, visit ntischool.com. Don't miss a beat. Find other episodes and subscribe to this podcast on YouTube, or check us out on your favorite streaming app. Now available on Apple Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and more. You can also visit nanp.org for more information. Looking for a board-certified holistic nutrition professional to support you on your health journey? Go to nanp.org to get started today. Membership in the NANP provides you with a competitive advantage. Whether you're a current practitioner or a student, We want you to become an active, informed leader of the holistic nutrition community and join our association today. When you're ready to go a step further, you can boost your credibility by becoming board certified in holistic nutrition. Visit nanp.org today to apply. The information on the NANP podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical or legal advice. The NANP is not liable or responsible for any harm, damage, or illness arising from the use of the information contained herein. By listening to the information on this podcast, you agree to defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the NANP and all agents. Copyright NANP, all rights reserved. Until next time, stay nourished.